My name is David Swerdlow. It says that right in front of here. I can remember that. I'm one of the co-directors of this revival of the James Wright Poetry Festival. We owe a great deal to Phil Turman, who called me up one day and he said, we ought to do this. We ought to go get some money and do this. And
Blame on me, David.
it's all praise, Phil. It's all praise. And it did come together quickly.
It's Bob Hoover.
It's Bob Hoover.
Right here.
So in this session, we'll take up the idea of why Wright still matters. I just have to say, if we'd only had Jonathan Blunk's talk this morning, I would have been satisfied. What a marvelous. I want to revise all of the remarks I prepared after hearing that, but I'm going to take that with me for a long time, and I'm sure many of you will. I'm going to offer my ideas on the subject of why James Wright still matters. I'll pass it on to Lori and to David Baker, our featured poet, who I'll be introducing more formally later today at his reading. And Jonathan Blunk will offer thoughts as they come. And I hope we have a little time for comments and questions as we come to the end of this. I'll begin with a quotation. I was the man. I suffered. I was there. In his 1962 essay, The Delicacy of Walt Whitman, James Wright offers what I found to be a surprising, spot-on evaluation of that famous line, I was the man, I suffered, I was there. Wright says, the line is great because it is not a boast, but a modest bit of information, almost as unobtrusive as a stage direction, or perhaps a whispered aside to the reader. Frankly, I think I went for years with an alternative reading of that line. I sort of thought as a, plant your flag in the dirt kind of moment. I was the man. I was there. I suffered. I misread that, I think. I much prefer Wright's reading. Earlier in that same essay, Wright quotes Whitman's description of the great artist. This is Whitman. He swears to his art, I will not be meddlesome. I will not have in my writing any elegance or effect or originality to hang in the way between me and the rest like curtains. I will have nothing hang in the way, not the richest curtains. Here, through Whitman, Wright is giving his sense of what poetry can be. It can unveil the man, the person, without being reductive. It can be simultaneously transparent and complex, humble and assertive. In this regard, I kind of remember, and I feel, I'm a bit of an imposter here. I like a quotation from Thelonious Monk, and I think I almost have it right. He says, a man's a genius just to play himself. I was the man, I suffered, I was there. James Wright began mattering to me in 1978 when I stumbled upon his poem, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, as I was winding my way through the History of American Sports exhibit at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C. I was 18 years old in 1978. I just graduated from high school where I played football, believe it or not. Regularly sacrificing my body by galloping terribly against my opponent's body. I was blown away by the poem. It embodied my experience. Almost immediately, I decided I would try to write poetry too. Through his poems, James Wright became a kind of father to me. I've been reading him ever since. As we know, Wright was born in 1927 in Ohio. These same facts apply to my actual father, Chuck Swerdlow, except he was born up north of here in Cleveland. Like Wright, my father served in occupation Japan, and I learned that David Baker's father also served in occupation Japan. Had my father met James Wright in Japan, I imagine he would have told me years later, oh yeah, I met James Wright. Trouble! But a mensch. A real person. A person of integrity, but not the easy kind, not when it's easy, I like to think James Wright and my father would have seen each other as having much in common beyond the facts of their birth. that they were in the service together. They were good men with serious flaws, men who struggled with mental health problems, self-harm, addiction. They had their doubts. They would have seen each other as common men, as opposed to what Wright, through Ortega y Gasset, identified as the barbarian, the mass man. The common man, quote, in his huge effort to see life as it is, becomes the noble man who struggles with perpetual doubt. The barbarian might have loved occupying another nation's land, right? Because he assumes in dealing with any problem that the first idle thought that pops into his head represents an absolute solution. A central horror is the appearance of the mass man, the barbarian, in the very seat of authority. Wright was writing that about the 20th century. Of course, the 21st century, it still applies, unfortunately. These days, we need mensches, common men, people who struggle with doubt. We have plenty of barbarians. Wright still matters because he's a mensch, a common person, and therefore a noble person who struggled with perpetual doubt. He pulled back the veil for us to see that struggle in its complexity. For me, Wright's poetry and its obsessions and its trajectory is a journey through struggle, sometimes elegant, sometimes ragged, often tragic, always, always, always human. While some may not enjoy Wright's work, I doubt any would accuse it of lacking humanity, of lacking a sincere human voice, a voice that is both familiar and noble. So many of the poems I read today are lacking sincerity, not because they don't yearn for it, but because it is so difficult to find that voice and to reveal it. Wright has great praise for the humanity of one of my favorite poets, Cesar Vallejo, who I love this, and I can think of Wright. I would want Wright to steal this line. He says, "I was born on a day when God was sick."
That's every day.
Yeah. Who hasn't felt that way, right? What Wright praises about Vallejo is very close to what I want to say in this vein about Wright himself. So I would like to sort of project his remarks back, right, onto Wright. In Vallejo, Wright asserts, we may see a great poet who lives neither in formalism nor in violence, but in imagination. He had the courage and stamina to bring his poetic imagination to bear on many different kinds of reality, the natural reality of hunger and pain, the immorality of fascism, the inner world of the soul, and to make whole poems out of this confrontation. That is why I think he is an important poet. And this is why James Wright still matters to me. And this is how I try to bring him to my friends and to my students who continue to live in this world that does need our attendance, our reverence, and our imaginative courage. So, thank you for listening to my humble remarks. I'm going to pass it on to Lori, who is, I love this, on her webpage. It says, memoirist, journalist, poet, writer, human.
Well, it's important now to say that we're not ChatGPT or AI.
It is. Her books are for sale out there. They're wonderful. Her latest is How Do You Like It Now, Gentlemen? Poems at Midlife from Brickhouse Books, winner of the 2021 Wicked Woman Prize. So check that out. I'll cut off the introduction now to save time, but a wonderful poet, wonderful writer, Lori Jakiela.
Thank you. Thank you, David. And when I was listening to you and talking about Wright as a mensch, and one of the things that I was thinking about when I was thinking about why Wright matters is that I think to be real, to be honest and truthful, to speak in a plain voice means to be vulnerable and to give yourself over and being vulnerable like that paves the way for other people to be vulnerable and to, share their stories and therefore make the world a little less lonely. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Wright's loneliness and why it matters right now. So I wanted to read a little bit. I know we're going to read Wright poems later, but it feels better for me to start with him. His poem, Northern Pike. All right, try this then. Everybody I know and care for, and everybody else is going to die in a loneliness I can't imagine and a pain I don't know. We had to go on living. We untangled the net. We slit the body of this fish open from the hinge of the tail to a place beneath the chin I wish I could sing of. I would just as soon we let the living go on living. An old poet whom we believe in said the same thing, and so we paused among the dark cattails and prayed for the muskrats, for the ripples below their tails, for the little movements that we knew the crawdads were making underwater, for the right-hand wrist of my cousin, who is a policeman. We prayed for the game warden's blindness. We prayed for the road home. We ate the fish. There must be something very beautiful in my body.
I'm so supposed to be the blindness.
No? Oh, yes. I am so very happy. Oh, my goodness.
Yes.
I am so happy.
I am so
I
happy.
am so happy. That poem, and again, I just made a joke about ChatGPT and AI. And I think if we ran a scan on James Wright's poems and how many times he uses the word loneliness, it would be remarkable. But loneliness in America right now, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is our Surgeon General, again, he was Surgeon General under Obama, then was fired, and then is back now as our Surgeon General. He says that loneliness is such an epidemic that is worse than COVID, it is worse than heart disease, it is worse than anything we face as humans. And he also says that one of the cures for loneliness, of course, is empathy, right? Empathy with each other. And James Wright's poetry, for me, embodies those two things simultaneously. He understands loneliness. He speaks fearlessly about being lonely, which Vivek Murthy will say, it's very embarrassing for people to say that they're lonely because it sort of implies there's something wrong with you, right? People don't like me. So people don't admit to loneliness. So to just admit it is to be brave and to be real. And Wright does it again and again, which allows us to say, me too, which makes the world less lonely, which helps us to heal. And Wright also, in his poems, presents us with empathy constantly. Empathy for the murderers, empathy for the lost people, empathy for the broken, because he sees it in himself, right? And I think in our times now, we are so divided that we cannot always engage with empathy, which is the most important thing, right? We are so divided that we are isolated in our own loneliness and sort of shouting into our own silos. And Wright showed us a way out of that, I think. And to read his poems are to find our own maps out of that loneliness. A couple things that Vivek Murthy says, and if you haven't read his book Together, I recommend it highly. It's really heartfelt. It's everything you imagine a doctor should be, and often isn't. Sometimes I teach courses in medical humanities to teach would-be doctors how to be people. And I'll say, well, when a patient comes in and they have a rash, you might want to talk to them about how they're doing and what kind of stress they have, and maybe just make sure that you know their name and you look at them and find out the cause of that. And the students who are doctors are very funny. They will write this down. Say hello. Look at patient. Sometimes we have to be taught, right? And Wright teaches us all the time. But Vivek Murthy says, loneliness, of course, has the potential to kill us. but connection has even more potential to heal, and that we have a universal need to connect with one another. And then he also says this, which I think really applies to Wright immensely as well. So if we talk about Wright in terms of the word lonely and loneliness, and in terms of empathy, but we also have to talk about Wright in terms of gratitude, right? Gratitude for these tiny moments that deliver us beauty and connection and ground us in the world, right? And so those of you who were here earlier for the writing exercise, that was something we were doing, is trying to remember a small and beautiful moment when you realized you were happy, and that line, "I have wasted my life," I spent years misreading that and realizing, of course, it means I am so happy, that this is here all the time. And Antonio Machado, the great Spanish poet who Wright had some affection, words are hard, affection for, said, all you need to be a poet is to pay attention, right? To really pay attention. And I think that speaks to our times now, too. I mean, how difficult it is for us to pay attention. How many times our phones buzz at us. And another book I can recommend to you is How to Break Up with Your Phone. It's a great book. You can get your life back. But paying attention to those tiny moments and stopping and just sitting still. We can't do it so much anymore, right? We've been inoculated by technology against things like solitude that create the space for us to make art or to be fully human. And Wright knew how important that was, how important it was to lie in a hammock, to sit still, and to take in the world. Vivek Murthy also says about that, research has found that humans are incapable of attending to multiple activities at once. What we're actually doing when we're multitasking is switching back and forth very rapidly, attending to each task separately but briefly. MIT neuroscientist Dr. Earl Miller explains, switching from task to task, you think you're actually paying attention to everything around you, but you're not. So I remember when that word multitasking started to become a thing, when you were asked in job interviews, how good are you at multitasking? And it was the beginning of the end, I think. Just a few more things connecting Murthy and our current condition with Wright. Empathy, of course, is choosing to see ourselves in another person despite our differences. We can choose, right? We are not locked into our politics. We are not locked into our class. We are not locked into these things irrevocably. We can choose to burst out of those, to break into blossom, as you will. We can choose beauty. We can choose hope, even though we know the human condition is more or less hopeless. But we can choose hope in those small moments, and we can choose what we give our attention to. We can choose who we see and connect with. We choose whether or not to smile at a stranger or not, or say hello or not. These tiny little moments that matter so much and that were never wasted on James Wright or his huge heart. Troubled, yes. Huge heart, no doubt. And I think that's pretty much all I had to say. Not the shame of feeling lonely. Everyone probably in this room at some point or even now, you can be lonely in a crowd. You can be lonely at home. We all have it. And there's no shame in it. And if we feel shame, I think we need only to turn to James Wright's poems and realize he's been there. He knows. And there's a way out. So, thank you.
Move it over to the phone. Yeah.
Well, I just have a couple of brief things. Thank you, Lori. And just to pick up on something Lori was talking about. When David and Phil mentioned that this was going to be part of the day's proceedings. Why does Wright still matter? It's a curious question because, of course, all the poems that matter to us are not segregated by, they don't have a shelf life, you know? I mean, it's like we carry these poems with us. But within a few minutes, actually, of having spoken to them on the phone and heard about this small talk, about why does Wright still matter, I came across a poem in the American Poetry Review. It was the March-April issue, so it would be current. And it's a poem by Kwame Dawes. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Kwame's work, marvelous African-American writer, Caribbean writer, but an American. And I came across this poem almost immediately. It's called Happiness. It has an epigraph from a poem by Jane Hirschfeld called The Weighing. And Hirschfeld writes, "So few grains of happiness measured against all the dark, and still the scales balance." In the middle of a Wright poem, the words, "Welcome my friend and me," arrest me, and I think of an empty sky blue enamel cup before tea, sitting on a table waiting to be filled and then brought to the lip. This business of friendships and horses and rain and the fullness that we long for in the completion of this ordinary moment. Maybe as long as I can say, my friend and me, I have the chance for happiness. Because on cold days in a foreign country, a cup, a blue piece of delicate clay molded, fired, and glazed, resting on a white table, with a large window letting in the seeping light of mornings, is all I have, despite the chaos in my dreams. And this is happiness, I think. This and the plain chai tea in the pot on the constant fire, steaming, waiting to be poured. I think the argument I would make is that James Wright has become part of our understanding of what poetry is. I mean, he's become one of those poets we can't get rid of, you know, which is probably one of the great ambitions. Isn't that what Frost said? You know, to try to write a poem good enough to make it hard to get rid of out of the anthology, like write a few good poems that nobody can quite get rid of, and that's something that strikes me about Wright. But I have, it's not that I have an investment in this. I just have a long experience with reading his poems, and yet having said that, I have been away from James Wright for a couple of years working on my own writing, and coming back to the complete poems has been a great joy for me. And I found poems that I had forgotten I had read before. Of course, I've read these poems many, many times, and yet there's such a wealth of poetry in James Wright that's kind of inexhaustible. So, I mean, that's another reason he matters. But the one, I was going to read another poem, but I won't do that now. But I will recommend it to you as a poem that might get overlooked. And it's in memory of Mayor Richard Daley, and it's in this journey. It's a poem that I think speaks to our time in a way that makes it seem prescient. I don't know if I mean, it's not a poem that folks kind of turn to regularly, but perhaps you remember how it begins. When you get down to it, which is the edge of town, you find a slab of gritstone face down in the burned stubble, the stinkweed, the sumac, the elderberry. Everything has gone out of the blossoms except the breath of rust from the railroad tracks. Now, this was written in 1977, and so this is like 2 years before that journal passage that I was just reading. So those physical details are like part of his imagination, really. But this is what I wanted to say about this poem. In my sleep, I sing to myself, remember, remember, this is what you're up against. There's a political dimension to this poem in speaking about the kind of horrific human that Daley, I mean, Daley was one of the last great, crime bosses of politics, right? And well, at a time, well, I mean, when it was like clearly organized, that people were like there was somebody who, well, I guess you're right. Wow. I mean, well, let's just say that Daley was a Democrat, right? You know? But that's exactly my point. Is that this poem? I mean, this is what we're up against, you know, and there are resources in his poems that I continually return to, and I think there's a great wealth of human knowledge embedded in this book. But please, David, why don't you take over?
Thank you, John. Move the mic over that way.
Yes.
Try to limit the feedback.
This thing scares me.
It's okay. You did.
Is that,
Are we
You're
good? Okay. I could listen to Jonathan. I would just as soon listen to Jonathan talk about James Wright all day than say anything myself. But I will say a few things myself. I've been editing quickly here. I tend to take. I was invited to talk to you. I'm David Baker for about 10 minutes, and I did a Jonathan Blunk thing. I way overdid it. I have a page of biography. I can talk about the 3 stages of James Wright's career. I went through and found a bunch of poems of James Wright's and how they connected to, let's see who I've got here, Berryman and Elizabeth Bishop and Emily Dickinson, on and on and on. And then I got up at 4 o'clock this morning and started over. You know how that is? Yes. I wish it were true that James Wright's poems are indelible and will never be taken out of the anthologies in our memory. I don't think that's true. That's why we're here. I went to an MFA workshop a couple of months ago, 12 students, and we were talking about who they've been reading, and they've been reading a little. I asked them, because I knew I was coming here, how many of you have been reading James Wright? 2 of them had never heard of James Wright. Most of them haven't read James Wright, or much of James Wright, though they've been studying, I don't know, Ada Limon and Richie Hoffman, and both fine young poets, to see how Ada Limon and Richie Hoffman have become famous on social media and have these great jobs, and that's what they're studying because they want that. Okay. This is more of the stuff that I want to say, like everybody, I want to say thank you. One thing that today is about is gratitude. So Phil and David and Dave and Tom put this together out of thin air in almost no time so that we could come here. And I want to say thank you to coming here, to you. I don't know if it's true that our loneliness goes away. I don't know if it's true, maybe, that we heal from that. I don't maybe think it is. I'm not sure poetry is medicinal. Harold Bloom says the greatest thing about that. Poetry is teaching us how to enlarge a solitary existence. And that solitary existence never goes away. It's what we live with. It's who we are. It's why we're here. Sorrow. Hopkins called it world woe. Guilt. Isolation. And the desire to sing about those things. So, my gratitude. This is at a weird moment in history when most of us in here, I suspect, never met James Wright. Some of you did. Most of us probably didn't. Though, if you look around, our demographic skews pretty clearly in a couple of directions that suggest maybe we did. I don't know. My father was born the year before James Wright. My mother was born 2 years after he was born, so I'm kind of the baby there. I'm about 2 steps removed from knowing James Wright. But Dave Smith is why I went to graduate school. And Stanley Plumley, I brought all my books. That's how lonely I am. Was probably my best friend. And what we do is make something like community out of our sorrow and our solitude, our bone loneliness. Not cohort, which is what the young poets of New York who come to me with their mangled figures of speech say. Our community is not the people we went to MFA school with. I don't have an MFA, but that doesn't matter. It's not the people who our publisher says we should hang around with. It's the people who show up. So I want to read a poem and then I want to talk about showing up. And I have 4 really quick points to make about why James Wright still matters. Bizarre that we have to make that case, but I'll make a little bit of that case. But I'm going to read a poem first. Here's why I'm here. This is to a blossoming pear tree. This book, this particular copy, was given to me by my teacher at Central Missouri State University, home of the Fighting Mules. Everybody runs into the football stadium and goes, hee-haw! I'm not kidding. But my teacher gave me this book. We didn't have creative writing, but he had his door open and he said, come and see me. And I was beginning to write poems in 1974, 1975, 1976 at this school. And he gave me this book. I'll show you what's cool about it. I had just finished, when this book came out, my MA thesis. Remember those? I wrote an MA thesis on W.S. Merwin, who was my first great love in contemporary poetry, who led me directly to James Wright. I had written at the top of the book, because I'd been studying W.S. Merwin, my name, D.A. Baker. I thought that was cool. And my teacher gave me this book, in which still I keep from Farrar, Straus, Giroux, the publisher's review copy slip from this book, which is kind of cool. And notes that this book was published on December 27, 1977. That's my birthday. I was 22. No, I wasn't. I was 23. And as I did then at 20, 22, I began clipping poems out of the New Yorker. Because I loved them. It was the magazine I subscribed to when I had no money and was trying to figure out where you would find poems. And here's some James Wright poems that I clipped out of the New Yorker. I'm going to read one to start with here. And Jonathan told me something incredible yesterday about this poem. I'm going to read The Journey, which leads to the title of his book, This Journey. This is The Journey. The amazing thing that Jonathan told me was that this is the final poem of his that James Wright saw in print. Is that right?
That's right.
In the New Yorker in February?
February 25th of 1980. He dies a month to the day later when this appeared in the New Yorker. And having seen this poem, it finally came to him what he was going to call his last book. He couldn't think of a title for it. And seeing this poem in the New Yorker, he said, that's it. I'll call it This Journey.
So we have to hear that one. The Journey. Anjari is medieval. A sleeve sloping down a steep hill, suddenly sweeping out to the edge of a cliff and dwindling. But far up the mountain behind the town, we too were swept out by the wind, alone with the Tuscan grass. Wind had been blowing across the hills for days, and everything now was gray and gold with dust. Everything we saw, even some small children scampering along a road, twittering Italian to a small caged bird. We sat beside them to rest in some brushwood, and I leaned down to rinse the dust from my face. I found the spider web there, whose hinges reeled heavily and crazily with the dust, whole mounds and cemeteries of it, sagging and scattering shadows among shells and wings. And then she stepped into the center of air, slender and fastidious, the golden hair of daylight along her shoulders. She poised there while ruins crumbled on every side of her, free of the dust, as though a moment before she had stepped inside the earth to bathe herself. I gazed close to her till at last she stepped away in her own good time. Many men have searched all over Tuscany and never found what I found there. The heart of the light itself, shelled and leaved, balancing on filaments themselves, falling. The secret of this journey is to let the wind blow its dust all over your body, to let it go on blowing, to step lightly all the way through your ruins, and not to lose any sleep over the dead, who will surely bury their own. Don't worry. So I carry that one in my little book. James Wright matters, number one, because we say so. I don't kid about that. We show up. We say so in our poems, in our teaching, in our writing, in our relationships with other people. We recognize our own loneliness and our own need, our sorrow, our world woe. There's that word again from Hopkins. Our shame. We don't heal from that. We make song, if we're lucky, from that. And that song points to something like the soul, to the world inside this one. We are a community of losers and a community of loners. My solitude recognizes yours when I write and when I read James Wright. There's Harold Bloom again. How to enlarge a solitary existence. But many people have said so. Dave Smith, Bob Jones, Larry Levis, Jim Barnes. These were people who came to me, or I found early on as a young writer, who pointed me to James Wright. When I went to Utah to do my PhD in 1979, Dave Smith was working on this book. I went there to study with Dave Smith. Larry Levis had said, go to Utah and study with Dave Smith. I went to Utah, and Dave was on leave for 2 of the 3 terms that I was there, and I did take an American poetry class with him, but he was working on this book. Over Christmas break, we had a meeting, and he broke the meeting because he went to New York to sit with James again in the hospital. He came back having seen James for the last time. We are a community, not a cohort. Number 2. The young poets of New York come to me with their mangled figures of speech, but they have little pity for the pure, clear word, right? We know that one. This is my second point. And full disclosure, I do seek the pure, clear word, but I also seek the impure, unclear word. I'm interested more in that word pity than anything else, because it connects, just as you said, to empathy, to sympathy, to some soulfulness that has its hands out. Recognition, to be seen, not superiority, not to feel sorry for or condescend to in pity, but to that. There is a hardness in much poetry right now. There is a certainty in much poetry right now that I find myself uninterested in. We speak, us young poets, about, as I said, our cohort, our self-selected, self-fulfilling group. We call each other, Jesus Christ, heroes. We call each other geniuses. Have you seen that? You know what I'm talking about. We call each other, this was about 10 years ago, rock stars. Bullshit. Really? Did you ever feel a man hold 65 cents in a hook and place it gently in your hand? I took it. That recognition, that soulful connection. Number 3, he matters because of that very reception, that very openness. That openness of form and his remarkable restlessness with form. I aspire to be that kind of amateur. I don't want to be a professional. We teach our students, we talk about how to be a professional poet. I was in an elevator in AWP, I swear to you, and 3 young poets were looking at each other over, and one said, "Dude, where'd you get those poet shoes?" Not kidding. To look the part, to buy the stuff. Poetry is not a brand. My poems are not a brand. They're not a commodity. We don't even possess our voice. I read an advertisement for a workshop that said, quote, "Come discover your voice and find your vision." That's not how it works, is it? You might find your style, you might discover aspects of style, but voice is that thing after the fact that seems to have emerged, whether you want it to or not, and sounds as awful as it sounds beautiful. I don't want to be a professional. And I read James Wright and I think he constantly put himself in the position of not knowing and taking some remarkable risks in maybe writing a poem that was just gonna flop. His MFA group wouldn't like that. Number 4, he matters because of that soulfulness. Something like a dark holiness that sometimes we see in the world, in the natural world, in the ruins that we have made, in the body, in some sort of beyondness that sometimes poems point to. They don't quite get there, but they point to, as far as language can get us there, to a door that's cracked that we look in and say, oh. And not many poets who do that, or who can do that. That nothingness that we sing about. For me, it's some ratio in James Wright wandering the world, not having a place, wandering the landscape and seeing in nature or in the village that world woe and that song, that openness to the world and to the human heart in all its ugliness and all of its beauty, and finding a name for those things. And it is a discovery of that newness over and over and over in his poems, in the best ones. So, James Wright matters because we say so. And we show up, and we talk about him, and read the poems, and take that away, right? When that work isn't done. That's what we'll do tonight. That's what we'll do tomorrow. That's what we'll do after and after and after. And many people have done that with James Wright. As I said, Stanley Plumley and Dave Smith and Galway Cannell and Mary Oliver and Larry Levis. Some of the obvious names, but I look with encouragement at some of the more unobvious names. Ishmael Reed, Marilyn Hacker, Dwayne Betts, Solmaz Sharif, Dan Beachy Quick, Cynthia Santana, Michael Harper, who have taken him and give him back. That's our job. Thank you.